Okay, so why do priors matter? Well, whether some belief, B, is a defeater for B star depends on what else I believe. So let's say that I believe that there's a sheep in the field, and then you tell me, no, that's not a sheep, that's a sheepdog. Now, is that a rebutting defeater for my belief? Does that show me that my belief is false? Well, it depends on what else I believe. If I already believe that you own the field, that you are an honest person, and that you would know if there are sheep in that field, then I have a rebutting defeater for my belief that I see a sheep. I know that my belief is false. If I already believe that you are a contrarian and that you love to contradict people just for fun, and that you're in no position to know whether there's a sheep in that field, then I won't acquire a rebutting defeater for my belief. So that's the importance of priors. What is rational for me to believe depends always on what I already believe. So here we get another crucial notion of an evidence base. Your evidence base is the set of beliefs that you use or to which you appeal whenever you're conducting inquiry. So one of the main functions of your evidence base is for evaluating possible hypotheses. So let's say your car won't start, and here's a hypothesis for you to consider about why your car won't start. My car is inhabited by an evil spirit who is out to cause me inconvenience and frustration. So that's one hypothetical explanation of what's causing the problems in my car. There's an evil spirit in it. So how do I evaluate that hypothesis? Well, again, it depends. It depends on what I already believe. So for me, the probability of that hypothesis is extremely low. I'd probably rate it at 0.001, and maybe you would too. But if I'm a Brazilian tribesman, then I'm going to evaluate that hypothesis initially as greater than 0.5, which means there's a 50% chance, greater than a 50% chance that there is some evil spirit who's inhabiting my car that wants to cause me inconvenience and frustration. All right, and the question to ask is the Brazilian tribesman irrational for believing that? Obviously, philosophers are going to argue about these things. And somebody might argue, yeah, indeed, he's irrational for having that kind of belief. But Plantinga doesn't think that it really works that way. What else could he do? When we update our beliefs, we do it by appealing to our evidence base. And our evidence base is constituted by the set of beliefs that you use when you're conducting inquiry. So, if it just so happens that the Brazilian tribesman has these really rich background beliefs about the world being inhabited by spirits, which sometimes try to cause you inconvenience and frustration, then it's not irrational for him to think that that's a likely explanation for why his car is failing in this instance. But it would be irrational for me to take that hypothesis seriously because I don't have any background commitments to this idea that there are spirits out to cause me inconvenience and frustration. Do you see the idea here? So this is something that really comes up a lot in political epistemology. So I was just talking to a colleague of mine recently, and she was saying, I can't believe that 66 million people voted for that guy. He is such a monster. How could so many people possibly think that it was reasonable or in any way rationally permissible to vote for someone like that? I think that it's easy to explain that, and that it's strange to think that it's so incredibly irrational and so beyond the pale of anyone's comprehension. The people who voted for the person in question have a rich set of background beliefs, an evidence base, and they appeal to those beliefs when evaluating evidence, when evaluating hypothesis, and when making a decision about what it's best to do. And given their set of background commitments, it actually makes a lot of sense that they would vote for the person in question. It just so happens that the policies that this person implements are compatible with, for example, their economic interests, their religious commitments, their hopes for the future of the country, and so on. I tend to think that Plantinga is right, that there's a way that you can think about rationality as following rational procedures for updating your beliefs in light of what you already believe. You can maybe argue that some beliefs are just intrinsically irrational, but I think that's really hard to sell. Plantinga also talks about philosophical naturalism, and he's interested in two flavors of it in particular. So one flavor is what he calls ontological naturalism, and this is a philosophical view about what exists. The ontological naturalist says, natural science tells us everything that there is, and there's no such thing as God or anything at all like God, because natural science can't tell us anything about God. So of what there is and of what can be known, natural science tells us everything. And since God can't be known through natural science, God doesn't exist. Again, ontological naturalism is not a scientific thesis, it's a philosophical one, a metaphysical one. And the other flavor of naturalism is methodological naturalism. This is the view that there's a specific constraint on which entities proper science can refer to. So the data set, theory, and evidence base of science will not invoke or make reference to God or any other supernatural agents. So to be clear, methodological naturalism is a constraint on scientific method. It's a constraint on scientific practice. It says science can't refer to anything that is non-natural or supernaturalistic. So methodological naturalism is a scientific commitment. It's a commitment about how to do science. Good science, proper science, shouldn't appeal to any supernaturalistic entities. But it doesn't take this metaphysical stance on the question of whether or not God exists. That would be a non-scientific commitment or an extra-scientific commitment, and that's the kind of commitment that the ontological naturalist has. Now let's use the idea of evidence bases to talk about how can we situate these evolutionary theories in a broader framework of religious or supernaturalistic belief. So he says when we do science, right, so when we're conducting inquiry as scientists, we have a scientific evidence base. And the scientific evidence base includes the claims of mathematics, logic, relevant current science, various common sense beliefs and propositions, for example, belief in the external world, and perhaps also maxims outlining proper scientific procedure. And then he says there's also what we could call a theistic evidence base. The theistic evidence base includes the scientific evidence base. Someone like Plantinga, who is doing the philosophy of religion, he's committed to all the main tenets of science, and he knows a lot about science. So, and his point is, people who are passionate about religion should know a lot about science and be committed to the deliverances of science, because a theistic evidence base includes the scientific evidence base, and then also belief in God and maybe some other claims that are specific to the monotheistic tradition. The point of this discussion so far is that, according to methodological naturalism, these propositions can't be part of the evidence base of a scientific inquiry. And on that claim, Plantinga agrees with all of the scientists. The point of dispute is not with methodological naturalism, it's rather with ontological naturalism, which adds in this extra claim that God doesn't exist. Okay, based on this discussion, Plantinga says, so there's weak methodological naturalism, and this is just a view that a scientific evidence base will not include the proposition that there's such a person as God or any other supernatural being. Okay, and Plantinga and all scientists, right, are on board with this claim. Nobody thinks that you should talk about God when you're doing science. Then he says there's also strong methodological naturalism, and this adds the denials of at least some religious beliefs to the evidence base. And again, this is echoing what he said in the last chapter. It's not surprising that the theories of strong methodological naturalism deny Christian belief because they bake atheism into their theories. So this is not a defeater for theistic belief. It takes the denial of God as part of its evidence base. And that, again, is just an assumption. It's just sort of taking for granted that God doesn't exist. So the important question, Plantinga says, is whether weak methodological naturalism, a form of naturalism that doesn't bake atheism into its very identity, into its very concept. What about that? Is that incompatible with theistic belief? He says no. He says science properly understood, which is science understood in terms of weak methodological naturalism, does not give the theist a defeater. Arguments guided by weak methodological naturalism show that with respect to the scientific evidence base, its conclusions are probable or sensible as good science. With respect to the theistic evidence base, the broader evidence base that includes the scientific evidence base and then also some religious claims, it shows that from the perspective of part of the theistic evidence base, weak methodological naturalism arguments are probable or sensible and constitute good science. So, with respect to part of her evidence base, her religious beliefs are improbable. But that need not give her a defeater for those beliefs. Why? Because her scientific evidence base is only part of her evidence base. She also has this broader theistic evidence base, which includes her belief in God and other things that flow from that belief in God. And so when she evaluates this kind of story from the perspective of that theistic evidence base, the Bloom type argument, or the Stark type argument, or the Atran type argument, or the Sloan-Wilson type argument, when she evaluates those evolutionary psychological explanations of the origin of religious belief, she steps back and considers them from the perspective of her theistic evidence base, and she says, well, of course, why wouldn't God endow us with early emerging universal cognitive biases that give rise to religious belief? So again, look at any of those evolutionary psychological arguments about the origin of religious belief strictly from the perspective of your scientific evidence base, then it seems like, yeah, that's fishy. Seems like those capacities that we have didn't evolve to track the truth about religious beliefs. And so from a strictly evolutionary standpoint, yeah, it seems like the religious beliefs that emerge from them, they must be wrong. But then, when you take a step back and you consider the claim from the point of view of this broader theistic framework, you say, well, yeah, of course, God loves us and wants us to know Him. Why wouldn't God endow us with these early emerging universal cognitive biases that make us tend to believe in God?